October 27th, 2012 is one of the most important days of the last 20 years in NBA history. That is the day that James Harden was traded from the Oklahoma City Thunder to the Houston Rockets, just 4 months after the Thunder had reached the NBA Finals with one of the most exciting young cores that the league had ever seen. And looking back on it now, the details of this trade and the endless amount of what-if scenarios that come to mind are truly mind-boggling. A team with a first-team All-NBA forward in Kevin Durant, a second-team All-NBA guard in Russell Westbrook, both of whom would go on to win MVPs, and a future MVP and one of the better scorers of the last decade in James Harden, all under 23 years old, on the same team, trading away Harden for role players, a young guard, and a draft pick. The trade seems inconceivable now. The timing, the trade compensation, the complete misevaluation on the Thunder's part of what Harden would eventually become, none of it really makes any sense. But everything that I just said, all of that context, you've heard it all before, and you probably also heard at least 2 or 3 reasons or excuses why the Thunder had to trade away Harden back in 2012. Well, I'm here to tell you that the circumstances that, so we've been told for almost a decade now, apparently necessitated a Harden trade simply could have been avoided, and in reality, the team never really needed to trade him at all.
We were very transparent, very direct, as we are with all of our negotiations with our players, as to the fact that we had reached a point where we needed to make a decision. We made a final proposal on Friday morning that was unacceptable. We then came back prior to executing or beginning to execute trade initiation with another proposal, and we were very transparent with James that if this was not acceptable, then we were going to have to move towards making the best decision for the franchise, given the fact that it was becoming a reality that more than likely he'd be signing elsewhere at the end of the season.
This is probably the main reason that we have been given as to why the Thunder had to trade away James Harden. They simply didn't have the money to retain him along with the other talented young players that they had on their roster, while also staying under the luxury tax, which was a stated goal of the ownership group. And it makes complete sense, right? They already had Durant and Westbrook on new deals. Serge Ibaka had signed a new extension just a few months before Harden was traded away, and they simply couldn't afford another great young player on their payroll moving forward. And it was also almost a way for the Thunder to kind of pat themselves on the back, right? Like, oh, look how well we've drafted. We've drafted so well that we can't afford all this young talent that we now have on this roster. And as I said, this reasoning makes sense. And most of the grievances that people have had over the years as it relates to the Thunder trading away Harden had to do with the fact that the team was simply being cheap. And had they paid the luxury tax, they could have retained him. Well, again, I'm here to tell you that those reasons just really aren't true. Because in reality, the Oklahoma City Thunder absolutely could have afforded to re-sign James Harden while also keeping Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and Serge Ibaka on their roster. So let's look at the contract negotiations at the time. Woj was reporting right before Harden was traded that he rejected a 4-year, $52 million deal from the Thunder and was seeking closer to the max of $60 million over a 4-year contract, and that him and the GM of the Thunder, Sam Presti, have been engaged in contract talks for several weeks. So now let's answer the question of whether or not they could have afforded Durant, Westbrook, Ibaka, and a new deal for Harden while also staying under the luxury tax. Well, going into that 2012-13 season, the one right after Harden was traded, Kevin Durant was making $16.7 million, Russell Westbrook was making $13.7 million, and Serge Ibaka was making $2.2. But for the following year, he would be making $12.2. So let's just, for argument's sake, put that number in here. And that total comes to about $42.6 million. And the salary cap for that 2012-13 season was $58 million. So when you take into account these numbers and Harden's asking price of around $15 million a year, they absolutely could have re-signed Harden and still been under the cap for those 4 players, even accounting for Ibaka's larger salary the following season. Now, obviously, you do have to fill out the rest of the roster, and if the team wanted to stay under the luxury tax of $70 million, which again was a stated goal of the ownership group, and one of the reasons cited for trading away Harden in the first place, that doesn't leave a ton of money, only around $13 million to fill out the other 10 roster spots that the team needed to fill. But at that point, who really cares? This is a strategy that had been adopted by other super teams where you have all of this talent at the top and you figure out the depth later. And on top of that, they have some of the most versatile players offensively and defensively of this era outside of Harden to try and make things work. These are guys that could have played multiple positions, guys like Durant, Westbrook, and Ibaka, so depth wouldn't have been as critical for this team anyway. So at this point, you're probably wondering, if I can sit here and figure out how the Thunder could have very easily kept James Harden back in 2012 rather than trading him away, why couldn't the Thunder figure this out all the way back in 2012? Well, that's because their payroll sheet didn't look exactly like this. Because the team had another big contract on their payroll outside of their younger Big Four, and that was Kendrick Perkins, a player that they traded for during the 2011 season to provide them an inside presence, as well as a player that had championship experience with his 2009 ring with the Boston Celtics. And on paper, it was a sound idea. They definitely needed size, they needed a big guy, they needed a little bit more of a veteran championship presence for all of their 23 and under young guys, and so it made sense. The problem for the Thunder, as it was for the Celtics, and one of the reasons that Perkins was traded in the first place, was that he needed a new contract. The Celtics had offered Perkins a 4-year, $22 million contract that he ended up rejecting, and after being traded to the Thunder, he signed a new contract with the team for 4 years and $36 million. And even though that doesn't seem like a huge contract number compared to the salary cap figures of today's NBA, this is truly where things get really, really dicey for the James Harden trade situation. Now, for some context, at the time of this Perkins extension, the team had Durant, Westbrook, Ibaka, and Harden on the roster. They had just won 55 games and lost in the Western Conference Finals to the eventual champion Mavericks, and Durant and Westbrook were clearly stars, while Harden and Ibaka hadn't quite blossomed yet, but were clearly valuable assets and very strong contributors. Meanwhile, Kendrick Perkins was also there, playing strong defense and rebounding, but not doing a whole lot else for that team. So with that context in mind, after that 2011 season was over, the decision was made to, even without having signed Ibaka or Harden to a new long-term deal yet, to sign Kendrick Perkins to a deal worth 15% of the salary cap. And in my opinion, this is ultimately where things went wrong for the Thunder, and the biggest financial reason for why this team ended before it should have, and why they ultimately ended up trading Harden in 2012. Now, the more common narrative is that they actually chose Serge Ibaka over James Harden because he did sign a new contract extension with the team about a month and a half before they traded away Harden. But had the team never traded for Perkins and or re-signed him to this big contract, they, as I outlined earlier, absolutely could have kept all four of those guys, been under the salary cap, and just filled out the rest of the roster with minimum or near minimum players. Now, yes, I absolutely understand that Kendrick Perkins did provide value to the Oklahoma City Thunder, and a lot of it went beyond the statistics. He provided a toughness. There are intangibles involved. There's defense and rebounding involved. But the bottom line was, it wouldn't have been difficult to look forward a year and a half and see, hey, we need to sign Serge Ibaka and James Harden to new contracts, and we are really hampering our ability to do that by signing Kendrick Perkins to this big deal. So ultimately, they misevaluated not only the needs of their roster, but their roster as a whole and what Harden and Ibaka would eventually become. Now, to be fair to the Thunder, they weren't the only team that misevaluated Harden, as he became something that nobody really ever thought that he could in Houston. But it wouldn't have been difficult for them to see that he was an extremely valuable young player that was going to want to be paid, and that signing Perkins would make it difficult to bring back both him and Ibaka while also staying under the luxury tax. So this, if you're going to look at financial reasons for why the Thunder traded away James Harden, it has more to do with bringing in Kendrick Perkins and re-signing him than anything else. Now, could there have been other reasons for trades down the road? Absolutely. The town might have not been big enough for all three of Harden and Westbrook and Durant, and probably one of them would have been traded at some point anyway. But the point was that going into this season, before they traded Harden, they would have been favorites in the West and potentially favorites in the entire league as a team that had just made the finals and had the most opportunity for internal improvement with their younger players. And they could have ridden out that season and then still dealt with the Harden thing after the year was over. They had an entire year still to make this decision, and they had his restricted free agency rights. He wouldn't have gone anywhere if they didn't want him to, but ultimately this team ended way before it should have. And it's not for the reasons that we've been given for almost a decade now. It is because of a misevaluation of the talent on the roster and a misappropriation of funds by the team and by the front office that ultimately they made up excuses for, but at the end of the day absolutely were foreseeable and preventable by the Oklahoma City Thunder. And ultimately, James Harden never needed to be traded when he was back in 2012. And yeah, there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed. My name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.